Welcome everyone. We will just wait 1 minute more and then we are starting. I hope that everyone is inside who is supposed to be inside. Okay, the doors are closed down, so I'll take it as a sign that we can go. Thank you so much for coming. Today we are honored to have the opportunity to talk with Elle. She's a co-founder and editor of a New Socialist magazine. She also edited a book, Transgender Marxism, that maybe some of you have seen, with Julia Gleason. And Elle is also writing a novel right now. What I found out in our informal conversation is that she's also very active regarding the status of Irish as a minority language. So she brings different perspectives that are going to be interesting to take a look at in her future work. So my name is Nina Čolović. I will be moderating the discussion afterwards, but now I'm going to give the floor to Elle to give us the perspective of the transphobic organization and movements in Great Britain. Unfortunately, we are all aware that everything is interconnected, that strategies and mechanisms to take away liberties of trans, non-binary, gender-diverse people in Croatia are very much taken from other contexts. So we need this experience to understand it better, to also to be aware what is coming. Maybe the situation in Britain and the US, it's kind of like the future that we want to derail from, that we want to take another direction. So maybe you can help us with that. So please.
Thank you. Thank you for Nina. Thank you, Carolina, for inviting me. It's really nice to be here in Croatia today. So I'm just going to talk a bit about a US and UK context. It might seem a bit remote, but I would like to open this up and have a more interesting discussion about the context here as well once we get into it. But so I think it's been impossible to escape notice over the past few years that transgender people have become a particularly important part of right-wing demonology. Echoing the campaign strategy of US Republicans, after an interim of social liberalism under David Cameron and Theresa May, an exhausted British Tory party has moved transgender issues to the front and centre of British politics. So the question of what is a woman and how can a woman have a penis is now a mainstream political issue, which would have been quite remote a decade ago. Alongside immigration, 15-minute cities, and fantasies of forced reduction in meat consumption by the eco-Stasi, the small constituency of transgender people have become an all-consuming figure of both fear and amusement on the reactionary right. At the same time, the public mood towards transgender people and trans issues is more sharply polarized than ever before. After an intense media campaign by both the tabloid press and a small, well-funded group of self-identified radical feminists, essentially all polling of social attitude surveys available suggests a notable portion of the British public has swung from a position of either indifference or ignorance to one of fear, disgust, and contempt for trans people. Whether that be on legal recognition, sports, transition care, or generally being able to participate in public life at all, there is now a significant political constituency that is animated by opposition to transgender rights in general. The movement has had notable political successes, enabling the British government to block the SNP's, the Scottish National Party's, long-delayed gender recognition reforms, legislation which formed the centrepiece of LGBT NGOs' civil reform platform in the UK for the past few years. Legal cases against NHS Tavistock and Portman Gender Identity Service Clinic for young people, where young people receive transition care, have thrown the future of transgender healthcare for children into heightened legal scrutiny and a certain amount of doubt about its long-term provision. UK gender clinics now no longer issue puberty blockers to anyone under the age of 18 on the back of recent campaigns. Because of that, even though it is now still legal, they have all just adopted a completely no issue of prescriptions for this anymore. I heard this the other day from a friend that there has been a notable increase in suicides among trans people who were on the gender identity service lists compared to the previous years before when puberty blockers were issued. So unlike America, gender identity services have not been withdrawn, but the strangling of trans healthcare and funding and its confinement within a purposefully pathologizing system of gender identity clinics has achieved the same effect, removing the possibility of timely and accessible healthcare for most people wishing to access such services, particularly those who are just coming out. The system is designed such that a whole generation of trans people will be suffocated, humiliated, and deterred from seeking the help they need for a more livable and tolerable existence. And then denouement of this campaign has been the Cash Review, billed as a thorough, independent, and scientifically rigorous review of gender identity services in the UK. The review process itself was easily captured by a small group of clinicians who advocate the continued pathologization of transgender identity, the further restriction of timely and efficient healthcare for young people, and the provision of anything but hormones and surgery except as a very last resort, and up to and including conversion therapy as a legitimate clinical practice. While one could take issue about the report's numerous scientific and ethical flaws, the Cash Review's evidence base and arguments place it well outside the international consensus of even the staid and conservative healthcare organizations such as WPATH. At the end of the day, the report's function is what it does. It exists to provide the long-awaited casus belli for the Conservative Party's assault on trans healthcare. The act of commissioning a report that suggests trans healthcare is controversial, risky, and scientifically questionable makes it so as an accomplished fact and provides precedents for a political and media consensus around the issue. Alongside this, there's been a distinct revival of open homophobia and attempts to change sex education in schools to marginalize LGBT issues in general. Lurid reports of children being taught age-inappropriate material by queer-inclusive relationship and sex education organizations form the basis of a current review. The Education Secretary Gillian Keegan recently issued new guidance proposing a blanket ban on all sex education before the age of 9, a ban on discussion of sexual acts, contraception, domestic and sexual violence will be barred until the age of 13. Framed specifically as a pushback against gender ideology, the guidance also insists that teachers must teach that there are only 2 biological sexes and that alternative views are controversial and contested. In a recent radio interview just last week, Keegan, the Education Secretary, made a distinction between gender reassignment, a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, and gender ideology, which had wormed its way into schools without governmental or parental oversight. Speaking to Radio 4, she notes, gender identity and ideology is something different, and this is part of probably similar campaigns that have been building this set of materials and this ideology. Asked to give an example of inappropriate content being taught, Keegan said, I've seen some materials where they talk about gender identity being a spectrum, there being many different genders, looking at, trying to get children to do quizzes on what's a different gender identity and what isn't, ignoring biological sex. A lot of that material has caused concern. It should be clear that there is a full spectrum pushback against effeminacy, gender deviancy, and the freedom of sexual expression on the British right. And I can recall for a long time there was a lot of puzzling over the particular national character of Britain and the British feminist movement, which was understood to have a hostility towards trans people that was sui generis of its own kind. What exactly was wrong with the British? In 2018, Edie Miller published a piece for The Outline that argued that British feminism developed its transphobic streak through 2 sources: the skeptics movement of the 2000s and 2010s, a new atheist sort of adjacent movement, which focused on debunking homeopathy, crystal healing, and junk science, and which many contemporary transphobic columnists were involved with, and unsurprisingly, the internet forum Mumsnet. Miller went on to argue that the US culture of liberal individualism safeguarded against the kind of transphobic radicalization that has infected sectors of British society. In 2019, the author Sophie Lewis wrote a piece for the New York Times called How British Feminism Became Anti-Trans. In it, they comment on a phenomenon that seemed notable and obviously unique at the time, the particularly vicious attitude that many stalwart figures of British feminism, both its liberal and radical variants, took towards trans issues in general and trans women in particular, with an emphasis on the figure of Posey Parker. Speaking as to why that might be the case, Lewis argued that Britain had a much weaker mass movement politics in the 90s to the 2010s, and thus middle and upper class feminists have not received the pummeling from black and indigenous feminists that their American counterparts have. In both cases, the arguments for the supposedly exceptional nature of the UK are either simplistic, pat, or in hindsight, extremely complacent. I don't think anyone can take stock of developments in the US, where hostility towards trans people has been readily adopted as a cornerstone of Republican policy, alongside a swathe of bathroom bills, attempts to criminalize transition care, forcibly detransition minors, and exclude trans people from employment protection, and consider this a peculiarly British affliction anymore. So my first point would be to make the case for pulling ourselves away from a self-regarding methodological nationalism that exceptionalizes Britain, and to consider the current wave of anti-trans hostility as part of a transnational wave of reaction, sharing tactics, literature, mutual networks of support and funding, an anti-trans internationale of sorts. What's interesting about this manifestation of it is how ideas travel and change along the way, or in how many cases they don't actually change much at all. And while the actual funding networks are somewhat murky and will probably remain so for many years, I don't think it will come as a shock that a lot of the funding and legal support is provided by the Christian right in America, with lawyers from groups such as Christian Concern forming the backbone of attempts to change legal rights for LGBT people, notably through cases such as Tavistock versus Bell. So there's a direct parallel between the slow, patient legal trolling or persistence hunting strategy that the anti-abortion movement adopted in America when they went through many decades of trying to influence the Supreme Court to overturn abortion as a right within the US. That was a direct anti-democratic strategy which focused on the legal apparatus rather than Parliament or campaigning to a broad mass audience. It was very much an elitist strategy. So we can make direct parallels between the movement strategy adopted in America and the anti-trans movement has adopted in the UK. And if you look back a decade or so, they had the same tactic with LGBT rights, gay cakes, homophobic hotels, religious adoption workers, and such like. So I'm going to offer a few examples here of what I mean by an anti-trans internationale. This is just a few, but it's by no means exhaustive. So aside from a very few marginal bloggers plugging away in the 2000s and the 2010s, what we might call the official coming out party for the current campaign against gender ideology is often credited to a pastoral letter by Polish bishops in 2013. The letter is an attack on what they label gender ideology, which they claim is the product of many decades of ideological and cultural changes that are deeply rooted in Marxism and neo-Marxism, endorsed by some feminist movements and the sexual revolution. Gender ideology is a pernicious cultural development which overthrows the unchangeable reality of biological sex in favor of an ideological, gendered self-determination, and weakens men, heterosexual families, and the institution of marriage. A few months before that, the conservative press and parents groups in Poland had been up in arms about a textbook for young children in schools called Equality Kindergarten, which sought to teach children that families come in all sorts of different forms and to respect those whose families are different from others. From there, a movement of street action, concerned parents' movements, and marches for life and equality in opposition to Poland's equality marches. My Polish friend says that they call them equality marches instead of pride marches, and one day we'll have pride marches in Poland. They were particularly galvanized by the victory of the Law and Justice Party in parliamentary elections in 2016, and the shelving of legislation under the previous government that would have enshrined certain rights for transgender people in law. This mobilization against gender ideology in Poland bears striking resemblance to a similar campaign in France. In 2013, conservative parents mobilized to resist a government campaign called ABCD L'Égalité, which aims to fight gender stereotypes in elementary education. Organized over text message, the campaign raised fears that a theory of gender, theory de genre, was teaching their children masturbation, homosexuality, social constructivism, and nihilism. Children were pulled out of school on specific days in protest, with some schools in Paris and Strasbourg losing up to a third of their kids on any given day. Much of this backlash emerges in the wake of François Hollande's Paris passing of marriage pour toi in 2013, equal marriage for all French citizens, gay or straight. This opposition was notable for being argued not just in the register of Catholic reaction, but the values of universalism, republicanism, and humanism. So reactionary literature repeatedly pressed the point that undermining the Republican values of marriage was a slippery slope to undermining the family, to transgenderism, to surrogacy, and reproductive technologies for same-sex couples. The Republican social and sexual contract was at the brink of falling into chaos, and with it, the very nation itself. In both cases, opposition to gender theory took on a specifically pseudo-anti-colonial character. Gender, being a foreign or loan word in French, becomes a synecdoche not just for rising domestic degeneracy, but the imposition of foreign values or cultural trends that are undermining the body politic itself. Whether that be the European Union and World Health Organization placing demands for LGBT recognition before the Polish government, or American queer theory feminizing the French Republic. The irony in the French case being that, of course, the American queer theory finds its theoretical roots in the French post-structuralism of Lacan, Derrida, and Foucault, or in Judith Butler's case, their most famous work, Gender Trouble, is something of a direct elaboration or adaptation of the materialist feminism of Monique Wittig to the buoyant consumer culture of 1990s America. In each of these cases, there's a powerful fantasy at work here, the idea that once there was a reliable gender order where men were men and women were women, but now things are more muddled or more fraught. And whilst this may seem like a contemporary reactionary concern, a recent source of contention, in truth, these anxieties have a long lineage. During times of great social stress or a great social change, these have been common complaints, with the effeminate transfeminine and the castrating transmasculine figure standing in as the example of the dawn of a more decadent social age, or occasionally a more enlightened gender dispensation. Throughout modern history, trans women find themselves and their experiences always represented as an allegory for something else. Rather than being treated on their own terms, trans women serve to ground the universality of cis experience. Modernist literature is replete with examples of trans women as metaphorical figures for the destabilization of inherited gender traditions. We are stand-ins for the broader destabilizations brought about by urbanization, suffrage, women entering new roles in the workforces, and with that attendant anxieties over masculine self-assurance and patriarchal entitlement. In other accounts, transgender experiences serve as an example of the dizzying techno-scientific achievements of modernity. Look what we can do, we can make men into women and women into men. Or in Freud's hands, we appear to be a degraded figure who is nevertheless a critical allegory for the unconscious that clarifies his theory of same-sex desire as inversion and the perpetual fear of castration anxiety. Here, willful feminization, willfully wanting to remove your penis, is a looming threat of egoic injury, clarifying the operation and universality of cis-sex for Freud. So why is that? Why is this such a perennial concern for state authorities and conservative forces alike? I think partly because class relations are never dried out and aloof, as more orthodox Marxist theories would have you believe, but by necessity implicate theories of gender, race, and sexuality. So political economy and sexual economy are intimately linked. Elsewhere, Angela Mitropoulos has theorized this as a nexus of oikonomia, the nexus of race, gender, and class, and sexuality and nation, constituted through the premise of the properly productive household. Material economies implicate sexual economies because theories of sexual reproduction and intergenerational inheritance are also theories of property ownership, wealth, and entitlement. Oikonomia here operates as a critique of economic discourse and its limits in apprehending social reality, including Marxist attempts that hypostasize capitalist society at the point of production, at the locus of exchange, and in the form of the wage. The problem of succession, the intergenerational reproduction of families and lineages, is a key problem of political economy, and it should be a key problem for Marxist theory. Under this lens, we can appreciate that gender, race, sexuality, and class are not discrete, neatly separable categories. They are not analysis for us to pull apart and theoretically then perhaps reassemble. They are different means of talking about the same social object, alternate perspective on the same question, property, exploitation, and social order, and their legitimate or illegitimate reproduction and conveyance from one generation to the next. I think this analysis is immensely fruitful in allowing us to deconstruct how the household property law, and marriage in preventing catastrophic disaccumulation through time and space from one generation to the next, play an essential role in sustaining the reproduction of capitalism, and why those that step outside of its purview are forced out face immense social sanction for doing so. How states treat their transgender populations tells us an immense amount about how society functions and operates more broadly. Ethno-nationalist policies are simultaneously patriarchal, familial, and racial, making claims about what a good and orderly world looks like, what is expected, demarcating who is entitled to what and what is expected of them in return, and then endeavoring to bring it about. But they do not just emerge ex nihilo, they rely on social scripts, codes, laws, and norms that are already accepted by wider society, on expectations that are fundamental to how capitalist society reproduces itself. Here, contingent social forms of gender and race become naturalized necessities. And we see this in far-right propaganda directed at trans women, essentially disgusted that anyone would transgress the bounds of the supposedly fixed biological designation of sex, and demonizing certain trans women in particular for failing to live up to an idealized performance of femininity, while at the same time trying to guarantee changes in law that make gender transition as legally adverse and as difficult as possible. Men are men, women are women, and there you shall remain. But we also see this in far-right racist propaganda, thinking of Cheryl Harris's important essay, Whiteness as Property, examining how race as a legal regime is codified in law, how property is a legal form, is inextricably racialized, and how conceptions of race as both a cultural or biological construction are always claims about property inheritances too. By extension, claims by radical feminist groups to something called sex-based rights, a lesser claim to equality in the tradition of the feminist movement, or a perverse offshoot of it, than a demand that cisgender identity be treated as a respectable status property, worthy of legal protection, and with it, like all property claims, the right to legitimate exclusion, in essence an untrammeled claim to cis supremacy over trans existence. Impositions of gendered expectations and racial discrimination are also claims about where the acceptable threshold of exploitation ought to lie, and on what terms. Whether your labor is waged or unwaged, whether it is compensated well or poorly, is contingent on your ability to embody a socially plausible form of masculinity or femininity within the boundaries set by what society understands your racial background to be. So what this social animus towards trans people represents is a political anxiety about the breakdown of these thresholds of exploitation, that they are increasingly difficult to verify, or are being directly challenged, or are not being enforced hard enough, is a particular concern. Here we're in the realm of political theology, what we desire and why. All moral economic parallels of sound money, productive capital, productive bodies, and the reproductive heterosexual family unit necessitate unrelenting disciplinary violence towards irrational speculation, unproductive capital, unproductive consumption, and unproductive desires. Social distinctions have never been greeted indifferently in the history of capital, but are an essential material force. They do this through racialized and gendered processes of making demands on time and surplus labor, organizing speculative operations into contractual bonds, underwriting the differential extension of credit and life chances to various social classes, apportioning labor between sectors and households, and demarcating certain modes of comportment and expression as socially valorized and compensated, or as demonized, excluded, and open to intense forms of socially validated violence. But the purpose of this talk isn't entirely a counsel of despair, so I will leave you with these points. First, a decade ago, the idea that transgender rights and dignity could be a fierce source of debate within national level party politics within the UK would have seemed a fairly quixotic proposal. Now every single politician has an answer to the trans question, and not all of them are hostile. This is driven not just by anti-trans hostility, but by the real breakthroughs that transgender people have made. First, asserting themselves in greater numbers in a world that they would rather they didn't. And second, their ability to capture the sympathy, solidarity of friends and loved ones, and more people in general. Just in the past decade or so, I've seen trans activists go from being a small number of angry bloggers, angry and often naive bloggers, to being a much more cannier, more organised force with the ability to shape popular consciousness and public debate in ways that far outstrip our relative proportion. Second, in the UK context, what's remarkable to me about every single move in the past 2 years is how shallow the forces of reaction are, how limited the campaigns of Tory right figures like Kemi Badenoch and Miriam Gates are compared to a similar moment in recent history. Margaret Thatcher's Family Values campaign and the imposition of Section 28 in the 1980s. There, Thatcher brought a parliamentary majority in support of Clause 28 of the Local Government Bill, which forced teachers and councils to explicitly rule out funding any LGBT organisations and made it illegal for teachers to say being gay is okay. In this case, the Tory party has been limited to issuing non-binding, non-statutory guidance in its campaign against gender ideology in school. While Section 28 was a crusade, the passage of a firmly held conviction to legislation, I think for a not insubstantial section of the Tory party, they just want Miriam Gates to leave them alone. So third, we have already lived through one historically unprecedented social miracle in most of our lifetimes. The rapid transformation in social attitudes towards lesbians and gays in just a decade or two, from the late 90s to the early 2010s. There is no comparable precedent in social attitude surveys for how many people change their mind on the single issue of homosexuality, and how quickly for any other social issue. Having lived through that as a gay teenager who came out at the time, how quickly society at large changed their mind on the issue still perplexes me. But it also makes me confident that something similar can and will happen with trans issues in the UK. John Curtis, he is the respected psophologist and current head of UK Polling Council, basically agrees with my assessment. Despite putting in terms I wouldn't, in a way his discussion of this is quite transphobic because he doesn't really care that much about the issue. But in an interview with the Herald on the 4th of May, he argues that among the British public, social transition is not controversial. It's just the question of a legal situation and going into the loos and younger people. And when you look at the structure of attitudes on transgender, it's very similar to attitudes on same-sex relationships about 20 years ago. He then states, we know that attitudes on trans have moved against making it easy for people. The gender-critical feminists have had the better of that argument. But then he compares it to another backlash, the backlash against LGBT people in the 80s at the height of the AIDS pandemic and Margaret Thatcher's campaign, which moved public opinion against same-sex relationships in the late 80s. The point is, will it indicate a long-term trend, or as AIDS did, or will it necessarily eventually, will we get more liberal? In the 80s, social attitudes against gay people moved very rapidly against LGBT people during the AIDS pandemic, but then quickly shifted down and became extremely liberal very shortly. So my final point, every breakthrough brings its reprisal. Every thoroughgoing social revolution is counter-revolution, and the trans issue will be no different. But if, in 1988, at the height of the AIDS crisis, Section 28, and the general public increasingly hostile to lesbian and gay people in general, you asked who would win? The combined forces of Margaret Thatcher, the tabloid newspapers, or the Catholic Church, or a small, irrelevant minority largely considered to be sexual perverts. Most people would have said Margaret Thatcher, tabloid newspapers, and the Catholic Church, and they would have been wrong.
I will start with a few questions, and then I will open the discussion that everybody can engage in and we can all together. What I was wondering, you mentioned lesbian and gay people who work towards changing society's attitudes, but now we see that capitalism very easily integrates lesbian and gay struggle, kind of practicizes it, because it offers again the possibility to enter a family that is going to again link to child rearing, to making sure that there is enough workforce to strengthen this framework of initiatives. So I'm wondering, when we look at trans organizing, when we think about organizing around trans issues, do you have that fear, or do you notice that already there is this kind of effort to kind of discipline friend life?
So, the concept of homonormativity by Lisa Duggan. So she counterposes it to heteronormativity, the idea of heterosexuality being normal, and in the late 90s and 2000s she wrote about homonormativity, which was the recuperation of gay identity towards same-sex marriage and all this sort of thing, and its pacification to what had been a resistant identity category. And this is Lisa Duggan's argument, and I think she's wrong. I think she is wrong about the idea of homonormativity in the sense that it rests on an illusion, and the illusion is that lesbians and gays were a resistant identity category to begin with. They were always varied and disparate and very much contentious, and they were all part of different classes. The idea that they represented a universality in potentia, that they could be a resistant subject, outstanding outside of the framework of capital and this sort of thing. It rested on a particular illusion that was not sustainable. That was one point. But in the second point I would make is that how effective has the recuperation of LGBT identity actually been? So people point to gay marriage as like the crescendo of the conservative LGBT rights movement. This was a demand put forth by right-wing constituencies of the lesbian and gay movement, which wanted to be introduced and integrated within marriage and the family and be able to access mortgages and credit and all this sort of thing. But if you look 20, 15 years later, what are the rates of people who are LGBT marrying compared to heterosexuals? It's about less than 20% of lesbians and gays get married. It's much higher among straight people. It's like 60, 70, much higher. So as I was thinking recently, a friend of mine had been discussing how he thought, queer would be a historically contingent category that could be fully recuperated by the capitalist system, and now it would capital would be indifferent to who or what or how reproduction took place. But I think this is something that is not the case actually, and we can see quite quickly how these backlashes against heterosexuality and the family, like anything that stands outside of it, can develop and gain force.
Thank you. As you mentioned, the family, and we see also values marriage and family and the conservative agenda. And one of the things that we find already in Marx, but also in the current texts of contemporary authors like Sophie Lewis, is that idea of abolition of the family, where trans, non-binary, queer lives show that a different kind of society is possible, that it's possible to interact with each other, to conceive our own bodies differently, conceptualize our own existence differently. And kind of it's a light that shows a different way. You were one of the co-editors of Transgender Marxism, and you were actively thinking about care, about the structure of family. So I was wondering, what are these alternatives to nuclear family, heteronormative family, that you see in your work and that you have seen in conversations with these different authors?
So Sophie Lewis is one author of family abolition stuff. She's been part of the revival of that. Michelle O'Brien recently a book on family abolition as well, who wrote a chapter for my book, and I've been kind of a bit perplexed by the latest stream of family abolitionist literature, mainly because I don't think they take the family seriously enough. I don't think they take the issue of succession and sexual economies as seriously as I would like. I think the issue of kinship and the issue of reproduction and the issue of how these things are passed on one generation to the next, as I said in my talk, is a central question of political economy, is a central question of states and rulers alike. And I always think it's extremely hard to step outside of kinship. No matter what you do, you will end up recreating kinship in some form or another. And so it falls to us to like think about how do we think about kinship in a more thoroughgoing way, while recognizing it's an ineluctable force in our lives. There's a book called The House of Government, which is like a 1,000-page history of an apartment in Stalin's Soviet Union, and the author concludes by arguing that the reason the Soviet Union failed was because it didn't abolish the family. And he is not a queer feminist at all. He's not a queer Marxist. But what happened was you had the generation who lived through the revolution create their children and have their children, and their children didn't want what their grandparents wanted. They wanted something different, and their grandparents also wanted to be able to give their children something of the good life that they had had. The issue of succession, even in Soviet or socialist economies, or however you want to define that, was front and central in its failure. And it's one of the things that I'm interested in is anthropologically or politically, literature that would think about kinship or the family in a very deep way that took seriously is social force, rather than just saying we could have a queer chosen family or such like that.
We were talking a little bit before the start, and we were talking about social reproduction theory. And one of the reasons why this publication was important, Transgender Marxism, because you were, with all these authors involved, you were talking about a kind of different reproductive work that trans people, non-binary people, queer people were engaged in. But also when we were discussing, you mentioned that you feel that it's not all encompassing, that social reproduction theory still has some blind spots. But so I would like you to reflect on that, to see a little bit how we should think about, or we could think about, social reproduction.
Yeah, so when I was editing the book with Jules, my co-author, she was very into social reproduction at the time. A lot of our authors come through the perspective of social reproduction, through Tiffany Bhattacharya and the recent revival in queer Marxist thought about social reproduction. Whereas myself, when I was editing the book, I had a certain amount of reticence about engaging with social reproduction because I'm not entirely sure that it is as critical a concept as it would like to be. So in Tiffany Bhattacharya, Nancy Fraser, Sue Ferguson, they have a perspective. Like Lisa Vogel, the author of Marxism and the Oppression of Women, defines social reproduction as the total social reproduction, the reproduction of society as a whole. Tiffany Bhattacharya, Nancy Fraser, Sue Ferguson, they edit that concept, and they edit that to bring in the idea of life-making, nurturing, and care. And this is, they move from a neutral analysis, or a ostensibly neutral analysis of the reproduction of society, into identifying care as a morally good or morally valuable sort of component of resistance to capitalism. I think with this sort of slippage comes a certain worry of mine. I don't see why I don't see why cooking meals and wrapping bandages is any more resistant or socially valuable than building a bridge or growing food on a farm. I think the issue I have with this is, I think the issue I have with this is, as I was saying in the talk, political theology, a political theology of desire. Why do people on the reactionary right hate us so much? And I'm not sure transgender identity can be reduced to the issue of reproductive labor, or queer identity can be reduced to the question of reproductive labor, because society would rather you not reproduce yourself at all, and you kind of just say, well, that's also reproductive labor. That's also, engaging in this sort of laboring process to make yourself anew every day so you can go out and wage work and all this. It's like, no, actually, capitalists, want you to eat and get to your job. They don't care if you're a queer or whatever like that. They don't care if you're trans in the same way. They don't care if you successfully reproduce yourself as a queer subject, as a trans subject. So by reducing transgender identity or trans issues or gender to reproductive labor alone, we miss out on the antagonism that is engaged with this, the antagonism that you must work through to reproduce yourself, to get yourself to be who you are, to self-actualize. The author Amy Deeth in the UK is engaging with this book as well. She's been she's been meaning to publish this book for a few years. It's called Antisocial Reproduction. I saw her present on it a few years ago, and it's still in the works. But basically, I think she's coming at this from the same angle as me, that there is missing political theology of desire in social reproduction theory that does not engage with, this is just not like an issue of reproductive labor. There is something here at work that is not like reproducible. Like Jules defines herself as not a gender abolitionist because she believes gender is expressive, and it's an expressive way of communicating your identity and engaging with other people.
That's interesting, because when you mentioned like gender is something expressive, and the gender is something that is a part of the capitalist system, where do you locate gender? How do you see that is the right way to engage with it? Because we need to like kind of navigate through the legal system, through the medical, but what I noticed, for example, is in Croatia at least, there is a lot of repathologization that is happening, in a sense that the word is given to the experts. In a sense, we have like this medical community that is somewhat friendly toward us, that is willing to engage with our needs. So we are very grateful, and we are going to step aside and let them speak. So kind of I feel like how do we manage to kind of to remove ourselves from this position that we are always in the negotiation with the structures that took away our liberty, and now we are asking them, oh, please give us some part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think medicalization is what happens when eliminationism fails. When they fail to eliminate you, they medicalize you and try to manage you through a medical system, a very narrow medical system. If you read what's her name? Jules Gill-Peterson's History of the Transgender Child, which is a history of transgender children who went through the early medical system at Johns Hopkins and Stanford University. This is basically very clear that when you cannot eliminate a transgender child, when you cannot engage in these sort of surgeries that, like at the time that this was happening, intersex and transgender were basically synonymous. So intersex bodies and transgender people were just like treated basically the same, or seen as part of a spectrum of disorders. When you cannot eliminate these people, and what the archives reveal is that, these people who passed through the clinic were generally middle-class children who knew what they wanted, and they were white, and they could advocate for themselves through a fiercely sort of very tenacious attitude towards like society at large. So they couldn't be eliminated, whereas the absence in the archives is black transgender children who are confined to asylums and killed. These children who did go through the medical system were the end result of being unable to remove them from society, and thus by saying that we can make you as close to cisgender as possible then, or we will treat you as transgender identity as something that can be explained in cis terms.
That's the distinction that you made, that they are more open in the Great Britain towards gender reassignment as idea than gender ideology. They are saying but I think that it's also that pressure that you need to enter the binary. There is still this discourse of full transition, whatever it is. So kind of it seems to me that when it comes to that space is open a little bit, it then becomes open to those who can most conform themselves. So yeah, as you mentioned, that is the difficulty.
And that is basically a recapitulation of Emma Heaney in her book The New Woman talks about how the idea of like trans women as being like men who become women, or become women once they've had the surgery, is a modernist allegory about making transgender identity fit to cis expectations. And in my lecture I talked about Freud, and that's how Freud treats transgender identity in 3 essays on sexuality. He basically uses the trans figure, the trans woman, as like someone who stands outside psychic life generally at all, like through castration, which structures not only the trans woman's sexuality, but cis sexuality in general, the prominent fear of castration throughout your whole sexual life as a man, or the absence of a penis in the case of a woman. These are the psychic injuries that we all carry.
the whole dehumanization of the person. But what I wanted to also talk with you about is this economy that is embedded into legalized economy, like this gray economy, people on the streets, people trying to survive, where a lot of trans women especially are put into this position that they cannot enter the workforce, and they are surviving in different ways, but their work, even though the legal economy, the state doesn't recognize, even punishes, sustains this whole system. It kind of is still exploitative position. So can you reflect a little bit on this position of trans women who are in this precarious situation?
Yeah, like for a very long time, and still right now, like transsexuality or being a trans woman is indexed socially to being a sex worker, right? Like you are penetrable, you are like open to being exploited. Generally throughout the world, it's quite common in every single country to have either a third gender, trans women or such, who are also survival sex work communities that live and work and survive basically through sex work. So what
I wanted to, like, if you could explain a little bit, if you follow what kind of situation is now in Britain. Are there any research? Are there any kind of the insight into the situation? How is right now?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think over the past 2 decades, I have a friend who came out. She's only like 8 years older than me, but she came out when she was 16. And so that was 2002, which was a very, very difficult time to be a trans woman. She got kicked out of school repeatedly for coming to school in a dress. When she went to university, she was studying maths, and she got chucked out of a window by her housemates and had to drop out of university. And she sofa surfed and was homeless for many years, and now managed to get herself a career in tech, and like is very much a very, very admirable trans activist who I respect so much. Her like situation though, like her situation is unimaginable for trans people coming out now. Like they sort of like brute bullying and also having it validated by the university that she was at is like would not really happen in the same way now. In the book, Michelle O'Brien wrote a chapter called Trans Work. Like there is a study or the concept called queer work, and what sort of work do queer people go into predominantly, and it was based on a study of like gay servicemen by, I forget the author's name now, but there are industries like lesbians who become like UPS drivers or work in steel mills, or gay men who become hairdressers or work in musical theatre and stuff like that. This is a stereotype, but it's also a sociological phenomena. It's the queer work, you know, why do all these gay people suddenly end up in this industry? Michelle O'Brien's question is, what is trans work? What are these industries that trans people go into predominantly and overwhelmingly? And first is sex work. Second, she finds, is tech. And third is also sexual services such as like AIDS crisis centers or like social workers, stuff like that. So these sort of like sociological studies about what is trans work and where do trans people find themselves in the labor market, nobody has actually really dug into this at the moment. It is like a completely, basically unstudied subject, like where are we working, how are we working? We do know in US surveys that trans women are probably like 60% below the median income or more. Most of them are under the poverty line. Trans men is slightly better, but it's quite a dire situation, and that can be explained by the types of work we are able to get into and the types of work we do when we do find work.
Yeah, I have one last question, and then I will give the microphone to you. I wanted to just also discuss this relation between anti-LGBTQ laws and racist practices, because when you look at American missionaries, as you mentioned, the evangelical church that started to kind of spread this right-wing stance against so-called gender ideology, as gender is, if not gender already isn't an ideology. Gender is in itself is, everything is ideological. But they went, for example, in Uganda, and they tried to put death punishment or prison for the rest of the life for queer people. And there was then a lot of conversation about how all these gender diverse communities during the colonial period first encountered this idea of binarism, this idea of only men and women, and now this is just reinforcing. Now again we have this effort to try to reorganize the way according to this European Eurocentric logic. So how do you see that we can address at the same time the questions of colonialization, race, and gender at the same time, especially as you mentioned, the difficulties of black children, black trans children who are trying to get the care they need?
Big question. I'm not entirely sure, like, on that question. Like, in the issue of like America is like a particularly unique case. Like I referenced Charlotte Harris's wonderful essay "Whiteness as Property" in the book and in my speech. She has an analysis of how property and race is a status property. It is good to be identified as white. It is disinheritable to be identified as black. And this may not be like consciously known, but in US law that was like particularly the case. She cites many legal precedents where like being accused of black or being denied something because you were white was like an exclusion from something you were entitled to. So whiteness as a status property is something she finds codified again and again into US law. When it comes to the question of colonialism, you know, I go back and forth on this because the issue of like binarism, like we were meant to have a contribution from Lebanon in the book, which like we went to have a contribution from loads of countries around the world. It ended up with one contribution from Brazil. But one of the authors from Lebanon, I forget her name, but she did write a piece about Joseph Massad. Joseph Massad, if anyone's familiar, wrote a book called Desiring Arabs. It's quite familiar in queer studies, and it argues that like, basically it argues that like homosexual or LGBT rights groups, by trying to impose the idea of gay identity, were engaging in like an overreach of universality, overreach of universalism, presuming that gay identity was a universal constant around the world as such. And his pushback was that like, this is like an overreach, is a colonial reach of Western groups. Her chapter, one of her papers that she's written elsewhere was like, actually, no, gay identity has spread so widely, and because we identify it, because we find it useful to reach onto the idea of gay identity, and we find something productive about identifying ourselves and mobilizing through the idea of gay identity. So whether something is like an imposition or an adaptation can go either way. So what I'm trying to say is this is also like transgender identity. Like when we talk about gender in non-colonial contexts, there is like discussions about third gender communities around the world who like hijara and stuff like this. As someone I know who's a Indian activist, she wrote a piece about like how hijara are now more identifying as transgender, and they find transgender as a resistant and mobilizing identity through which they can understand and make their social demands intelligible. To be like a third gender is not always to be respected within the context of which you are. It is to be marginalized within society as such, be put in a place that is exclusionary, to be like forced to engage in survival sex work and stuff like this. And transgender identity or LGBT identity for many people has found and resistant character that I'm like wondering about like how to interpret that sort of like adaptation by activists throughout the world.
Thank you so much. I would have more questions, but I don't want to take the floor, and I would ask you maybe if you want to ask something or maybe comment or...
Yeah, as you, Nina, kind of said something in this direction already, but I'm have a little bit of a general question of what's your thinking on the possible alignment of the struggle for transgender rights and the struggle at the same time for gender abolitionism, since we, as you said, kind of gender is a limiting category for, and a constructed category for all of us. For transgender people, sometimes fatally limiting, but it is something like similar to race, where it is a construct, which of course doesn't mean that a struggle for black rights is any less relevant because race is a construct. So I'm not trying to take from the urgency of the struggle for transgender rights, but I'm just thinking, I just want to ask, do you see the abolishment of gender as an ultimate political goal, and how do you see it in connection with the struggle for transgender rights?
Okay, so both me and Jules are not gender abolitionists as such. Jules wrote a two-part piece, which is on the history of gender abolitionism, and she said to me it was like basically her working through what she understands gender abolitionism to mean and what she would like, how she relates to that tradition. And I think we both do not relate to that tradition as such. And as I was saying about social reproduction theory, it is my question about reducing gender or transgender or LGBT or anything like that to reproductive labor as such. And I feel in lots of accounts I've read, or people who define themselves as gender abolitionists, and the way we've discussed and gone back and forth about it, I cannot like, you know, I don't have like an outside of what gender is, I can't say this is what gender is and this is my alternative, but I don't think gender is a reproductive labor category. I think it doesn't entirely reduce to that. And as such, I don't think gender as like how we understand it as an oppressive social system is reducible to enforcing demands for domestic labor or such onto people. So I can only express a certain uncertainty about like gender abolitionism, or a hesitancy rather than like a clear idea.
Thank you.
What do you think of J.K. Rowling and the whole... Yeah, I know. What I wanted to go with is the rise of the LGBT movement. And specifically, what do you think of the difference in the LGBT movement and the queer movement, of it going, saying to the cishet society that the LGBT is a way for them to categorize queerness? If you fit in some kind of category, you need to fit in a letter in order to exist. And if you don't fit in a letter, then we're not going to let you exist. And the whole rise of the LGBT movement and excluding the T and excluding anyone else who doesn't fit a certain specific kind of category. Do you think it's just pandering to cis people, or how do you view it, especially in Britain, where it's, I think Britain and America is the biggest like contribution of the LGBT movement currently?
So as far as J.K. Rowling goes, I don't really think about her much at all. When it comes to like the LGBT Alliance, they are like a political pressure group in the UK, if you're not familiar. They have famous people, well, like famous people like Kathleen Stock and Julie Bindel, long time, either like radical feminists or anti-trans activists, or like, you know, how far they're actually engaged with feminism anymore is a question, really. But they're also in the UK, they're officed on 5 Tufton Street, and if you don't know, Tufton Street in London is a place where along this street is like a few buildings, and all these right-wing think tanks have their offices there, and someone is paying for their office on Tufton Street. There was a leak of their internal membership, like registers and stuff like that, and basically it came out in the wash that like all these people who signed up to be part of the LGBT Alliance and such weren't even gay or weren't even lesbians. There was like 95% of them were straight people who signed up to their mailing list or signed up to the organization. They don't really exist. There are like a couple of like quite conservative like gays on Twitter who just like hate trannies or whatever, but like as a social constituency, like I keep going back to UK polling reports because I just find it interesting thinking about demographic trends or opinions or like long-term trends. There was like a recent survey of social attitudes towards trans people among the lesbian and gay community. It turned out that lesbians like trans women and trans people in general more than trans people like themselves. It was something like 86% of lesbians have a positive or very positive opinion of like trans people, and it was like 80% of trans people have a positive opinion of trans people. Gay men were actually the big drop-off. It's where it goes to like 65, 70%. So gay men were, you know, letting the side down there to a certain extent. But like they keep trying to make the LGBT alliance happen in the UK, or like have like some genuine sort of like community, or like a lesbian and gay bar that only allows lesbians and gays and no trans people allowed and stuff like that. And like there is no constituency for this, either in the existing gay community or lesbian community, or like in broader society. There are just not enough people outside of like Twitter accounts that make this happen. They're just not they're not a demographic that matters. They don't, like, apart from like being reported in the right-wing press, they exist to issue press releases, and there are like 4 of them.
Thank you.
I guess we are all aware of the theoretical project on different strands of Marxist theory, trying to prove that gender, race, and class are somehow structurally necessary for the capitalist relation. Where do you locate yourself in relations to that theoretical project? You already showed a certain skepticism to social reproduction theory, but maybe you can extend on that.
Okay, so I came at social reproduction theory kind of orthogonally. My project was more in the relation between Angela Metropolis. She is a friend of mine, but like doesn't really have the wide readership that I think she deserves. She wrote a book called Contract and Contagion, and very timely. It was written like 2013 or something, but it is about contracts, legal systems, and pandemics. How do we organize society? So, and how do we think about social order when it is going well, or how do we when it is going badly? Like pandemics are the limit point in critical theory because they are the moments when social order starts to break down. And her understanding through Contract and Contagion is a queer Marxist reading of contracts and history to come at the idea that there is a certain thing of political theology of desire. And that is my interest and my understanding and my relation to queer Marxisms rather than social reproduction theory. She has a colleague who she's collaborated a lot with. She is now much more widely read. She's called Melinda Cooper. She wrote a book called Family Values, and she's got a new one coming out soon. She just did an interview in the BAFTA magazine, which I recommend you all read. The Family Values book is a reading of key neoliberal thinkers like Gary Brecker, Milton Friedman, all these other sort of like writers on neoliberal thought. And her argument is that like people who study neoliberalism think it's weird that like the conservative right, the Reagan right, Thatcher, who brought about the neoliberal ascendancy, were also very socially conservative. And through her reading of these individuals, she's like, no, actually, it makes perfect sense. They had an idea of the social market, which was like, you know, where people engaged with, and but they also had an idea of the family. Every single neoliberal writer is actually obsessed with the family. Gary Becker writes about marriage markets. Milton Friedman writes about marriage. Hayek is like, his understanding is that we don't need welfare because people will have their families. Every single neoliberal thinker talks about the family obsessively in a way that is not acknowledged until basically Melinda Cooper laid it all down. And her, you know, she's very comfortable. Her argument in the BAFTA magazine interview, which she recently released, is like, the right is very comfortable about thinking about sexual economy and material economy together. The left, not so much. And so we need to bring it from a marginal queer Marxist perspective and put it front and center of our analysis. And that would be my understanding of the project.
Thank you for that talk. That was super interesting. Just kind of following on from the Melinda Cooper stuff, like she comments on how the kind of Trump base and the kind of who Trump mobilizes is generally kind of private family capital, right? As opposed, and then they kind of have this like antagonism with multinational capital and this kind of transnational thing, and the difference between the kind of incorporated company and the kind of publicly traded company or something like this. And you mentioned like Miriam Cates in your talk, who is like a kind of reactionary figure in the Conservative Party who is increasing in prominence. But they, and the sort of core of the people that she has around them, they're really like strong on the kind of like family being at the core of the nation and this kind of like communitarian Toryism or something like this. But I think, like, from my observations, it seems just like this kind of like discourse is growing more audible around the kind of family and the defense of kind of small and medium businesses, particularly in Britain. You've seen it a lot at the National Conservatism conferences, and also Jordan Peterson's new kind of project, Alliance of Responsible Citizenship. It's really kind of like emphasizing the importance of, small, medium-sized businesses, and they're kind of articulating a sort of critique of globalism, and they're kind of, this is the kind of counterpoint to that. They're kind of like taking the tropes of the globalization movement, but kind of reconstituting it on the right. Sorry, long-winded, but like I wonder, like where you see the kind of British political landscape developing with figures like Miriam Cates and these kind of like what I see as kind of like quite surging movements at the moment, and maybe in relation to the kind of election that is going on and probable Tory defeat, and then the kind of like, I was wondering, like, kind of future-oriented question, just like these sorts of dynamics that are at play. Do you see a kind of direction of travel or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, the question is, are these movements actually surging, is what I think. I don't think they are. Like, as I said in the talk, like Miriam Cates, Kemi Badenoch, these are, like, Miriam Cates, for those who don't know, she is, in the UK, she is a Conservative MP. She's also an evangelical right-wing Christian. In the UK, nobody is an evangelical right-wing Christian. Nobody. It's very much like, you know, like being a fan of, like, American baseball or something like that. Like, you have to really, like, go out of your way to be an evangelical right-wing Christian. But for some reason, like, in the Tory party, there are loads of evangelical right-wing Christians. There's probably like 20 of them out of the current parliament. Like, and they have an outsized influence on UK policy, and they're also very close with American evangelical right-wing Christians. There's a documentary from like a decade ago about Nadine Dorris, who used to be like the big figure in this. It's her, and it's like a panorama special where like they do this filming of Nadine Dorris meeting all these headbanger evangelical Christians and like all this around her campaign to like reduce abortion from 24 to 12 weeks. So Miriam Cates, Kemi Badenoch, Nadine Dorris, these were the core of like the anti-trans movement, and like, you know, one of the issues about conservative thought is that like they never take right-wing women seriously, right? Like the left has never really taken right-wing women seriously on their own terms. So when you look at the history of the abortion movement in America, the anti-abortion movement, people think it was actually like men who brought the anti-abortion case to like conservative politics. No, it was women. If you listen to the podcast Know Your Enemy, there's like a long history of like the anti-abortion movement and how it was like right-wing women who brought this conservative feminism to the conservative movement. And in the UK case, it's Kemi Badenoch, it's Miriam Cates, but they've had years to make their case, and what is their achievement at the end of it? They blocked the SNP's reform bill, and that is their crowning achievement. But they have not been able to gain a parliamentary majority for this, like, because they've probably been knocking on Rishi Sunak's office going, yeah, women, blah, 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 toilets, blah, 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 and it's like, they're just like, do we really want to stick our hands in the blood on this one? Do we really want to get down in the dirt and just have to go on about like what is a woman for 6 months before we pass this? It's like they haven't got the energy that like Section 28 has. I think this is like the high watermark of this sort of anti-trans antagonism is in the UK. Like, I think I'm the only person who is arguing that it is the high watermark of the anti-trans antagonism in the UK. I think the Tory party has made this front and centre of their politics, and they're now about to go to their biggest electoral defeat in their history. You know, so what do you think the future of it is? Not much. Like,
You might find it interesting to know that also in Croatia, the same happened with the right-wing women. They brought it up to conversation again and changing laws, unfortunately.
so would anyone like to explain the Croatian context to me? Is it like very similar to like other contexts that I've discussed, or?
Yeah, so we can compare a bit and to see. Here we have this movement that is being built like roughly from the like 2010s. Like there was like in 2013 a referendum where the group named In the Name of the Family tried to limit and successfully limited the right to for queer people to enter the institution of marriage. Then it became the question of reproductive rights came also on the table, where the same association, together with other Christian conservative groups, as Vigilare, for example, they tried to restrict right to abortion, and then when Croatia was in the conversation around the ratification of Istanbul Convention, they put a lot of pressure trying to make the state not to sign it, not to ratify it, or because they were saying, oh, gender ideology is coming through the back door through Istanbul Convention. And it was used to hurt trans people in every possible way. And now we have extreme right party in the government, Domovinski Pokret, and their program when it comes to gender is very much disturbing. They want to pay women to stay home and take care of children. Of course, when you are paid to stay home, you are not able to enter the labor market because it's or this or this. And they want to pay for people to get married. Yes, that's also in the program. It's caricatural. So these right-wing groups, they are working very hard to restrict access to healthcare for trans people. And that is one thing that I wanted to ask, because we have, when we take a look at the right to abortion and right to receive medical care as a trans person, as a non-binary person, we are talking about the same struggle. We are all trying to to have our basic needs met, but still this togetherness, this collective of mutual support and mutual understanding is facing difficulties. That we can understand each other, that we can that we can connect these movements that were never apart, that were always one struggle to connect them together. So what I see as an issue that is most pressing for me, it is how to organize solidarity, how to organize people so they can recognize that the violence only functions in different way, but it stems from the same source. So can you maybe tell us a little bit what is going on in the UK? How do you organize solidarity? Can we learn something from you?
in the UK, I was involved for many years with an organisation called Queer Care. We were like a social solidarity and support group for trans women. We would come around to trans women's houses, like clean up their house because they had depression, and then we'd take them to the doctors, and then we'd shout at the doctors to say, under the section of the Royal College of Nurses Act, here is why you should give this person hormones, and if you don't do it, you're transphobic, and rah, 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 rah. And, you know, in a good chunk of cases, we get the hormones. Just these sort of like activities. We have like mutual aid where we give each other hormones and patches and this sort of thing. And they're more and more developed than they were in the 90s or 2000s. But like for everything that we see in the news and the media and everything that's like prominent and public facing, there are all these networks and solidarities being built among people that nobody knows about unless you need to know. Or like trans people are coming out more and more to their families, and their families are not always rejecting them. Like there are more people who care about trans people now, who know a trans person, who love a trans person than there were 20 years ago. And that is only going to continue to be the case. In terms of like struggles in the past, you know, I can't speak about Croatia, but I can speak about Ireland, like where my family and where I'm from. Like in the 80s, we had a big reaction. In the 80s and the 90s, there was referendums that put the 8th Amendment in the 90s. The 8th Amendment to the Constitution banned abortion. And this was like the high watermark of a conservative campaign among the public to make abortion illegal. Finally, like, you know, criminalize it as a constitutional issue. As it came about, like, you know, there was a referendum in the 90s to repeal this, and it failed. And everyone since then expected the referendum to fail. It passed, you know, just a few years ago. But the development in Ireland was you had a very conservative society, a very religious society. You know, I imagine there are certain homologies here between Ireland and Croatia, right? But over the time, what people hadn't noticed was that ostensibly, you know, this was a very conservative society, and in the 80s, the Pope visited, and millions of people in Ireland came out to see the Pope, and everyone, you know, loved the Pope, and everyone loved God, and everyone loved the Catholic Church. Unbeknownst to like everyone else, there were all sorts of other social processes that were happening that were changing the society irrevocably. And so women were like leaving the rural villages and going to Dublin and working and wanting contraception and having all these sort of things and getting access to contraception and issues like that. And for a while, there was a contradiction between how people were living and working now and the social attitudes and surveys and like understandings that they had of themselves. And over time, these were worn down, and over time, these were changed. And like from seeing Ireland as a backwater province full of like fascist nuns and like under the heel of the Catholic Church, it has now become like, wow, isn't Ireland this wonderful social bastion of liberalism in a relatively like Europe that's on the backswing, you know? It's like these sort of things, like they may seem like inevitable or irrevocable, but they are always like forces working against it and changing it from within, and there is always like hope that things will be better.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have another question.
I think we can't talk about the current political climate in Croatia without mentioning the colloquial term for them is kneelers. They're Christian nationalists who, I don't know if you're aware, but they kneel every first Saturday in the main square for female purity, against abortion, for the woman to be obedient to the man, against gay people, against trans people and everything. The movement started in Poland, I think, 5 to 10 years ago, and they managed to ban abortion there, which now the European legislatives have stepped in, and I'm not aware of the whole Polish situation right now, but from Poland, the Archbishop spread its influence to Croatia, Slovenia, Hungary, I'm not sure how many other countries. And it started a year and a half ago in Zagreb, and from there they spread to 17 cities in Croatia. So now every first Saturday of the month you can find on the main squares of the 17 cities people kneeling for that. And in Zagreb and in a couple of other cities, you have a counter-protest, which I was part of the organization of the early counter-protests, which we weren't even aware of. Okay, how are we going to do this? Are we allowed to even do this? Are the police just going to come and get us and like tell us to fuck off or jail us? Which arrests have been happening recently, and ever since the far-right party has stepped in charge, there is a sort of air of police brutality against alternative and queer people rising, and Christian nationalism being a bigger presence than usual, even though most of Croatia, I think around 70%, identifies as Christian. But in the past even couple of weeks, I think we can see a lot more rise in this, as some alternative spaces have been attacked, raided by police. People have been brutalized. Like it's getting serious in here. Yeah, just wanted to shed light on that, on a bit of a political climate right now.
Thank you.
Maybe just short. You said that anti-trans movement doesn't have a good footing, but nevertheless we have things like the CAS report, like recently, that is supposedly scientific, but then even the author of it starts backtrailing, and also that you don't like to think about J.K. Rowling, but even like someone that is not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, even nominally, is sometimes enough to have her quoted by some politician in some legislature as a reason for. So can you comment a bit on this like CAS report and like maybe the institutional inertia when there is not even a large enough movement, but if you are positioned in the right places, you know, like something like a blank key idea of change.
Yeah, so the CAS report has been commissioned like a few years ago, and it's led by Hilary Cass, who is meant to be a pediatrician. She is meant to be the independent pediatrician who is reviewing transgender healthcare for young people in the UK. The CAS report came about because over the past decade, referrals to gender identity clinics in the UK have exploded, and people trying to access healthcare through them has become like a crisis. Like my partner's gender identity clinic in Sheffield is not really a clinic anymore. It's just like an answering machine, and you can't get through because there's no way that they can manage all these cases. They tried to open a few like new experimental gender identity clinics that were a bit more lenient and a bit more trans-inclusive, but very much still, we're going to take it very slowly, and you have to go through 2 appointments and stuff like that. Basically, the bureaucracy has been unable to cope with a big social change, and that big social change is trans people demanding better healthcare or being able to assert themselves in like greater numbers. And the response to this has been one of panic, and it's like, how will this bureaucracy manage this huge new population other than just giving it money, or like without having to change much at all? Hilary Cass's response to this has been basically this sort of like issue is a social contagion, and we cannot have this many trans people. There are too many trans people in the UK, and maybe there should be less, and maybe we need to think about not having this many people have surgery or this many people have hormones. But the institutional issue itself is a crisis of the medicalization model. The medicalization model says, if you go through this very long pathway, and if you prove yourself like worthy, then we'll give you this. And to my mind, like the big dispute about puberty blockers and surgery and JSAs in the UK, like nobody seems to acknowledge that the GIC system itself is a form of conversion therapy. The issue is that if you prove yourself, if you go through a certain amount of persistence, if you like show a certain amount of commitment and you get through it, then you can have your transgender healthcare. So by trying to make it as difficult and arduous as possible, it is an act of conversion therapy in and of itself. And the crisis in Hilary Cass's report is that the issue of puberty blockers is front and center. Puberty blockers themselves, in my mind, are also an act of conversion therapy. They're like, we're not going to give you hormones that your peers are having at the same time. You cannot enter puberty until you're past 16, So you have time to think. I mean, the person has already come to the clinic, the child has already come to the clinic saying, this is my identity and this is who I am, this is the healthcare I need. And you're saying, no, we'll give you time to think. And the issue is not the child needs time to think, the child is quite consistent and persistent about who they are. The question is time to think for the doctors to say, oh, maybe you could be something else. Maybe you could be non-binary, and by non-binary I mean you don't have any hormones at all, rather than being non-binary with top surgery or whatever like that. So this is just basically a crisis of way, like in America, you have a free market, like a private healthcare system, right? In the UK, you have a state bureaucracy that manages it. In both cases, the restrictions are the same, which is to try and ban these sort of like issues. But because it's a state bureaucracy in the UK, what they've done is to ban it through rationing it so that like, oh, right, you've signed up and now it will take you 7 years to get even to like the top of the list. So that's effectively gone. That does not exist anymore. That is not an option for you anymore.
I just remember that you said this really interesting thing about transphobia being portrayed as some sort of pseudo anti-colonialism. And I think this is very relevant for our society because, and generally, I think the Balkans and the post-Soviet countries where trans people and gay people are seen as some sort of Western import that is not native to our society, that is some sort of ideological domination coming from the West. So I am interested in how this like geographical element of this whole story is portrayed in the UK, which is the West that we are saying that this is coming from. I suppose that you're not saying this is native to our society, but you are like, where are you placing, or where is the right wing placing the fault for this in the UK?
So I think in the UK, so in Poland, they were blaming the World Health Organization and the EU for forcing them to have this gender equality legislation. You mentioned the Istanbul Directive in Croatia, another like imposition of the EU bureaucracy on like the poor Croatia or poor Poland, or, in the UK, it's all generally, like, as far as they like blame anyone else, it is just like American queer theory again, which is very funny. Yeah, so they I mean, it's hard to it does seem like, gender and queer theory and all this like free wishy-washy nonsense is a bit much for like staunch English empiricism, good old-fashioned John Stuart Mill and John Locke and all this sort of thing. It's totally out of the tradition with our this American wishy-washy philosophy is totally out of like British tradition of analytics and stuff like that.
As Carolina said, we will continue the conversation over this, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and coming here, and also opening up for this conversation, because I know that it's challenging to go to in a different context that you're not familiar with, and I hope that this will be the opportunity for us to exchange a little bit what is going on and to see how to better.
Thank you so much. Thank you.